The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of 8 News Now or Nexstar Media Group.
The pace has picked up considerably. We're getting to the finish line.
Down to the final days, we explore new laws created by the legislature and the work left as the session ends.
There have been numerous policy changes, and yes, they are working.
Police reform. Metro Police talks about changes they've made while state lawmakers pass their own measures.
It was just horrific, and it just breaks your heart.
Wild horses sold for slaughter. The I-Team investigates a federal adoption program.
From 8 News Now, this is Politics Now.
The final days of the 2021 legislative session are here. Thank you for joining us on Politics Now. I'm John Langler. So the session ends Monday night. There is still a lot of voting and negotiating to be done in Carson City. For example, one law that has already been signed, hush payments, no longer going to keep victims of sexual harassment or discrimination quiet. The governor signed Assembly Bill 60 into law. It voids non-disclosure agreements if they're covering up a crime or discrimination. It was those type of agreements that disgraced movie producer Harvey Weinstein, Steve Wynn, had their accusers sign. It takes effect immediately. Also signed in Carson City, people with drug convictions will soon be able to get state benefits for food and child care. Governor Sisolak signed Assembly Bill 138 this week. It reverses state law, which had kept people convicted of drug dealing crimes from family or food assistance programs. That kicks in July 1st. The off-again, on-again film tax credit legislation is now on again. Assembly Bill 20 is now law. In its previous incarnation, the tax credit funded movies like Paul Blart 2. Sports and events are not eligible for the tax credit. 60% of a budget on a movie has to be spent in Nevada in order to qualify for the credit. Nevada is one step closer to becoming the first state to vote in the next presidential election in the primaries. A bill to move Nevada from first in the West to first in the country passed the Assembly this week. It also switches Nevada from a caucus to a primary setup. The bill is now heading over to the state Senate. A separate bill that would mail a ballot to voters every election period also passed the Assembly. Voters would have to opt out of mail-in ballots. You would automatically get one. A group of strange bedfellows have gotten together to oppose some proposed gun control legislation. Senate Bill 452 is proposed by Senate Majority Leader Nicole Cannizzaro. It creates criminal penalties for people who carry a gun into a business where there is a no guns allowed sign. Democratic groups like the ACLU oppose it. They say it would cause minorities to have more tense and dangerous interactions with police. Republican groups like the Nevada Firearms Coalition also oppose it. They say trespassing laws already accomplish the same thing. Now, this measure has narrowly passed the Senate 11-10 and now heads over to the state assembly. So bottom line is there is still a lot of work left to get done and not a lot of time. We spoke with Republican Assembly Minority Floor Leader Tom Roberts about what to expect in the final days.
It's really started slow. The session, we were slow on getting bills introduced, slow on moving bills, and there's been quite a bit of logjam here at the end, where we're moving a lot of bills in a short amount of time, which is always the case when you only have 120 days. It seems like it's rushed. This time, it seems like there are a lot more bills that are still out there that we're still working on as we get close to the deadline. So I think it's a little worse than it has been before. But, you know, we're picking up steam and you know, we're heading to the finish line now.
Do you envision a special session?
I believe we're going to have a special session for a couple of reasons. Not because we didn't get the work done here. The American Rescue Plan money that is coming, we've gotten preliminary guidance, but I believe that to move some of those funds once we get them, we'll probably have to come session. I don't believe the Interim Finance Committee can do all that on their own. And then redistricting, because the census data probably won't be available till August or September, we will have to have a special session to do redistricting.
A lot of talk at the beginning of the session had to do with, especially from Republicans up there, election reform, the mail-in balloting that we saw in 2020. Are you confident that what has happened so far in the session will ensure a proper election next time around?
So Speaker Frierson has a bill. It was actually voted out last night, Assembly Bill 321, I believe it is. It is his omnibus election reform bill. He's got a lot of good things in there, but there's still some things that concern us.
What concerns you?
Well, an all mail-in ballot and some of the ballot harvesting issues, are concerns for us. There's a cost associated to all mail-in ballots. Rather there's an opt-out portion, which could reduce your costs. But in our opinion, mailing a lot of ballots that aren't going to get used. The last election cycle, only 38% of those ballots were actually mailed in. At a huge cost to taxpayers. I think we could do it cheaper, or you phase it in over time to allow people to get used to the system. You work out some of the bugs, and so that people have faith in the system. The ballot harvesting issue, which I believe could be or might be watered down, and we're still working on that. We're going to work on that in the other house with the speaker. I can't go to a polling place as an elected official with my campaign shirt on, but I could certainly show up to your house, knock on your door, and collect your ballot. The way it was during the pandemic, the last election. He's putting some safeguards in there. There's still some things that we'll work out. But look, if there's a significant part of the population that doesn't have faith and trust in our election system, I think it is real, and we need to address those concerns.
Is enough being done to get Dieter into the present?
We just passed an appropriation with rescue plan money for $43 million to upgrade their computer system. That's the first shot of money for that. The disappointing part is it's going to take time to implement that. During the special session, we passed legislation to allow them flexibility to address the backlog of claims. We've given them additional people. We've done a number of things, and they still struggle with delivering, their services to the people that need them. I still get some calls, but not quite as many as I did before. Very frustrated with it.
And again, that was Assemblyman Tom Roberts. Now, we should point out Governor Sisolak has not used his veto pen yet during the legislative session. The last session up in Carson City that did not have a veto was back in 2003 with former Governor Kenny Gwinn. A reminder, we're going to be in Carson City to cover the last few days of the legislative session. The I-Team's David Charnes will have live reports Sunday and Monday when the session ends. And you can watch all of our coverage right here on Channel 8 and, of course, on 8newsnow.com. In Washington, Nevada Congressman Stephen Horsford joined fellow Democrats in a meeting with the family of George Floyd. It has now been 1 year since Floyd was murdered by a former Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin.
I'm a parent. I have 3 kids, so to hear Gianna, who's 7 years old, talk about her dad and what she wants, which is for him to be remembered around the world, not because of his death or how he died, but through this passage of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act.
Now, House lawmakers did pass a police reform bill. However, it's stalled in the Senate right now. If approved, it would ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants. The measure would also create a national registry for officers who are disciplined for serious misconduct. Republicans object to changes that allow individual police officers to be sued for their actions.
I think we're making the kind of progress that we need to make.
That is South Carolina Senator Tim Scott. He is the lead negotiator for the Republicans. He says both Republicans and Democrats are still trying to work on a compromise on this issue. Nevada, though, did take steps this week on no-knock warrants. During a Breaking Down Barriers special right here on 8 News Now this week, Metro Police discussed other changes that have been made in the past year. Here's Orko Manna.
Las Vegas joining the nation in protest following the murder of George Floyd 1 year ago. Attention quickly turned to tactics used by Metro Police.
There have been numerous policy changes, and yes, they are working.
While use of force policies have been updated, 2 new bills in Nevada signed into law Tuesday by Governor Steve Sisolak take things a step further. One allows the Attorney General's office to do pattern or practice investigations to see if an issue with law enforcement is just the isolated actions of one officer or if it's part of a larger systemic issue. The other severely limits no-knock warrants. So the question is, will this make a difference?
We're moving in the right direction because it is not just a few bad apples, sort of that are ruining the punch.
But activists add there's more work to be done.
It's a start, but we still have to continue to move it forward. This is not nearly enough. This is just only the beginning.
Metro understands the road ahead is long, but the department is willing to work with the community.
And I couldn't agree more with inviting the AG's office into our investigations. We're an organization that is not afraid of progressive change.
The goal is to create an inclusive environment and honor George Floyd's legacy.
So I hope that we continue this track together.
Orko Manna, 8 News Now.
You can watch the full conversation from our Breaking Down Barriers special at 8newsnow.com. We would like to thank again Captain Yaz Yatomi from Metro Police, Kennedy Cobbin Richardson, and NAACP Las Vegas Chapter President Roxanne McCoy for joining us for that program. You heard from them in that story there. Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo has told 8 News Now the no-knock warrant bill only really adopts Metro's existing policy. Now it is state law. He says that he is glad the Attorney General can now do those pattern or practice investigations in Nevada. Well, here's a question. Who will be Nevada's next governor? Next on Politics Now, we'll look at how the field is shaping up for next year's election.
Terribles to you. Welcome back to Politics Now.
All right, let's talk about the race for Nevada governor. This week, Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo confirmed to 8 News Now he is running for the job.
I can confirm that with you, but unfortunately, I got caught off a little off guard up there in Reno. But I got to be frank with the public, and I am running for governor. We plan on a formal announcement here in the next coming weeks, and I will display or provide my platform moving forward at that time.
Lombardo is a Republican. He first said that he would run for governor officially to a TV station up in Reno, which is what he was referring to there. Also, as you heard, Lombardo has not unveiled a platform, a political platform outside of law enforcement. He says he's going to do that in the next couple of weeks. As for his potential opponents in the Republican field for governor, District 2 Congressman Mark Amodei says he is still weighing whether or not to run. Amodei told the Reno Gazette-Journal he likes his chances because his district is where most of Nevada's Republican votes lie. Amodei is known as more of a moderate Republican. He was also, though, the state chair for the Trump campaign in 2020. Politico reports former Nevada Senator Dean Heller is considering also jumping into the governor's race. Heller lost his re-election bid in the Senate to Jackie Rosen in 2018. While in the Senate, Heller was often one of the swing votes on key legislation. North Las Vegas Mayor John Lee is also running for governor as a Republican. So why do so many Republicans think current Democratic Governor Steve Sisolak is vulnerable in the next election? Well, look at this. Back in March, the Las Vegas Review-Journal had a poll, and it found 48% of those who took part approved of the governor's performance as governor. 48%, I beg your pardon. 43% disapproved, and 10% were unsure. 52% approved of his handling of the coronavirus. Those back in March, we should point out. Next on Politics Now, are wild horses being sold for food?
We're calling it Slaughtergate. It happens about every decade.
The I-Team exposes an investigation into the West's iconic symbols being turned into food. Plus this.
Lawmakers are taking a look at how to prevent a devastating wildfire season like we saw last year. I'm Alexandra Limon in Washington.
Of MysteryWire.com. You're watching Politics Now.
Keeping wildfires from burning through the West. That was the goal of a hearing in Congress this week. The U.S. Forest Service chief says climate change is fueling more frequent and more severe wildfires. Last year, more federal land burned across the country than any year since 1910.
The crisis results from a changing climate. It induces severe wildfires, droughts, insects, disease, and invasive species.
If we fail, fire borrowing will come roaring back, doing major damage to the Forest Service.
Wildfires. Alex Limon from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Alex, Senator Merkley from Oregon brought up what he called fire borrowing. What is fire borrowing and why is it a problem?
Fire borrowing is something that the U.S. Forest Service used for many years to fight these massive and devastating fires that we see out west and that continue to get worse and worse every year. And so essentially what the Forest Service would do is once they ran out of money in their regular budget to fight these fires, they would borrow from other parts of their budget, sometimes, well, a lot of times, frequently, from the parts of the budget that they're supposed to use to staff for preventative measures, staff the Forest Service year-round, for example, to clear dry and dead brush and all of the mechanisms that would prevent these types of wildfires, or at least help to make them not as severe. The money for that would be gone. And so it would create kind of this endless cycle that Senator Merkley says is just devastating for the Forest Service. And Congress actually approved a fix for that. And they created essentially similar to a FEMA budget, a FEMA emergency fund, for example, so that the Forest Service could tap into that money instead.
Did Congress, did lawmakers have anything else or suggest anything else the Forest Service can do to try and help with wildfire prevention and get ahead of the situation?
Yeah, definitely. They concentrated a lot. We heard a little bit about it in that story on the issue of hiring and retaining staff. Again, going back to this idea of trying to prevent the wildfires, or at least trying to prevent them from getting so out of control in the first place. And one of the issues the Forest Service has is that they don't have apparently the staff necessary year-round to go in and do that prevention, the clearing that's necessary to get rid of the fuels that fuel these fires.
And again, that was Alex Limon from Washington, D.C. She referenced staffing. Another problem is retaining firefighters. The average Forest Service firefighter, for example, the salary about $35,000. Well, from wildfires to wild horses. Wild horses are a beloved symbol of the West. They're part of the American landscape. The I-Team here at 8 News Now has covered wild horses and the issues surrounding them for years. The I-Team's Vanessa Murphy now tells us an investigation has revealed some are being sold for slaughter.
You have these iconic American, symbols of freedom that are being brutally butchered and shipped off for foreign horse meat markets overseas.
Executive Director Suzanne Roy says the American Wild Horse Campaign teamed up with the New York Times for an in-depth investigation, which revealed wild horses are being sold for slaughter.
We're calling it Slaughtergate. It happens about every decade. The BLM gets exposed for sending horses, federally protected wild horses and burros, to slaughter. And the reason this is happening is because the BLM keeps rounding up wild horses.
By law, the Bureau of Land Management is authorized to capture wild horses and burros for the health and productivity of public lands. Wild horse advocates point to cattle ranchers and their interest in the land for their livestock. In recent years, there has been a record-breaking number of roundups, in some instances causing injuries and deaths to the animals. The ones that survive are kept in federal holding pens. Through a federal program, an individual is offered $1,000 to adopt one horse. But Roy says some people were taking the money, selling the animals, and through the investigation and tracking, it was discovered some animals were headed to be killed for human consumption.
It was just horrific, and it just breaks your heart when you see people under false pretenses say we're going to adopt a pony.
Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus is a longtime advocate for wild horses. According to the BLM, as of March 2020, there were nearly 47,000 wild horses in the state. That's more than half of all the wild horses in the country. Congresswoman Titus and Roy say they support a method of birth control through darts for the animals. Advocates say it's more cost-effective and more humane than roundups. But so far, the BLM has shown resistance.
We've never come up with somebody in the BLM who really cares about this. And I think now Secretary Holland will be the person who can be a good partner for us.
The I-Team's request for an interview with the new Secretary of Interior who oversees the BLM was declined. The American Wild Horse Campaign is now calling for an investigation into the adoption program. It wants employees held accountable, criminal prosecution for those who sold the animals for slaughter, and for lawmakers to step in. Congresswoman Titus says gradually there is more interest in legislation, but there is also a challenge.
Sometimes it's hard to get through the Agriculture Committee, though, because it's so dominated by ranching interests.
Vanessa Murphy, 8 News Now.
Congresswoman Titus says she receives the most amount of letters about this issue of the wild horses. People from all over the country, she says, show support for wild horses even if they've never actually seen one in person.
Only at Jack in the Box.
In What to Watch, we're keeping an eye on the final days of the legislative session. Will a tax on mining companies pay for education? Will it get passed? That could be one of the trades to have some extra money into state coffers. Plus, how different will elections look in 2021? We're watching a handful of bills that could drastically change how Nevada does elections, including one to make us a primary and jump us to first in the country. And as we mentioned earlier, we're going to be in Carson City to cover the end of the legislative session. The I-Team's David Charnes will have live reports tomorrow and on Monday until the session ends. You can watch all of our coverage right here on Channel 8 and, of course, on 8newsnow.com. With that, we thank you very much for watching us here on Politics Now. Stay up to date online at 8newsnow.com. We'll be back with you next Saturday.